Later tonight, I'll probably start on the arduous task of reconstructing the Schubert Quintet video, which has been blocked by YouTube on account of a presumed copyright infringement. This is going to cost me several days of pretty intense work. If this one meets with the same fate that the last one did, I may very well call halt to this labor of love. In the meantime, while I prepare myself for that eventuality, I'm going to finish reading the Barbara Kingsolver essay that I began yesterday. This is the second half of the lead essay in her collection, Small Wonder. The essay also bears that title. Ms. Kingsolver begins by quoting some lines from Robert Frost. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun. In his poem Mending Wall, Robert Frost invokes the image of his neighbor walking the fence line, intent on constant survey and repair, here and there raising up a boulder between his hands like an old stone savage armed, to put it back in its place, determined to keep this boundary intact, though it restrains only trees. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. Good fences make good neighbors is the only rationale the neighbor will offer, as his father said before him. The poet is baffled at so much resolute effort. And so we might all well feel baffled as we awaken this morning to find the greatest part of our ways and means invested in the walls our nations have built between ourselves and those whom we wish to keep out. Throughout our modern history, we have taken each step in the construction of defensive borders with few doubts in mind. From stones to bricks and mortar, to rifles and barbed wire, to missiles and tanks and the firestorm contained in an atom. And now here we are, devoted to the efforts of surveillance, repair, and dread. Borders crumble. They won't hold together on their own. We have to shore them up constantly. They are fortified and patrolled by armed guards, these fences that divide a party of elegant diners on one side from the children on the other, whose thin legs curve like wishbones, whose large eyes peer through the barbed wire at so much food. There is no wall high enough to make good in such a neighborhood. For this, of course, is what fences divide. Probably we began with more theoretical notions of ethnic purity, the wish to keep the apples out of our pines, and for most of the last century we rationalized our walls in terms of ideology, but the Iron Curtain has now dramatically fallen. Now we have fashioned from the crumbling boundaries of the Cold War a whole new shape of division, fundamentally between rich and poor. That chasm keeps growing. A quarter of the world's poor are now poorer than they were 15 years ago, having struggled only to lose ground. The hard boundary between the haves and the have-nots is still defended with armaments, but now it is also bridged by a dancing, illusory world of material wants. Passing through every wall are electronic beams that create a shadow play of desire staged by the puppeteers of globalized commerce, who fund their advertising each year with more than $100 spent for this planet's every man, woman, child. This world of inequality is also a world of solitude, writes Eduardo Galeano, in which multitudes of the desperate are led to confuse being with having, and condemned to have not. In the name of God and all the fishes, $100 for every human alive, solely to lure them all into want. To consider this material tyranny is to begin, surely, to understand why protest against the global corporate order throws itself down weeping in the streets from Seattle to Genoa to Pakistan. Imagine how it looks from the other side, where undulating female bodies sell soft drinks to the likes of the nomads in Lorestan province. This omnipresent shadow play ignores the genuine differences of culture that legitimately distinguish us, pretending instead that we are all of one mind and share in an equal and endless pocketbook. But in truth, it relies on other kinds of fences, ever-increasing fortifications of the heart and treasury. Global commerce is driven by a single conviction, the inalienable right to earn profit, regardless of any human cost. No one argues that this is untrue. It is also proving unassailable. When Guatemala passed laws intended to encourage low-income mothers to breastfeed rather than use imported infant foods, for instance, the world's largest baby food manufacturer circumvented these rules by threatening to invoke GATT and other trade sanctions. When Europeans favored importing bananas from the Caribbean and Canary Islands over buying fruit grown where working conditions are worse, they were similarly thwarted. The laws governing international trade render it more difficult each year to inject moral considerations into the marketplace, frustrating the many nations and individuals who still wish to balance economic motives with compassionate ones. Indeed, international trade laws increasingly restrict access to the very information that makes any such concession possible. Witness, for example, the endless battle for accurate labeling waged by U.S. consumers who prefer their food organically grown and not genetically modified. The profiteering drive of commerce owns no malice or mercy, is incapable of regret, and takes no prisoners. It is simply an engine with no objective but to feed itself. And it is a Goliath. A decade ago, the combined sales of the world's 10 largest corporations exceeded the gross national product of the world's 100 smallest countries put together, and the gap is growing. Inevitably, hungry souls and angry hands rise up against that amoral giant, and ever higher walls of armaments are required to keep them at bay. These walls create among us a huge class that the French author Jacques Attali has named the millennial losers, for whom the fantasy of prosperity promoted by the media is both a continuous allure and an endless slapdown. The siren's song calls them toward Paris and New York, glittering emerald cities walled off by inaccessibility. In his 1991 book, Millennium, Winners and Losers in the Coming World Order, Attali observed with a chilling prescience that particularly among those in the Middle East who had suffered repeated humiliations by the West, the fiercely absent presence of worldly affluence tended to inspire fervent cults of frustration and outrage. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. We who are alive in this moment didn't build those walls, nor did we ignite the fury that has smoldered for eons and hurls itself at us now as a burning question. But we have inherited the urgent necessity of answering it, and possibly we will succeed. It isn't only the insane rage of the dispossessed that burns against these walls. It is also, from inside the house of privilege, the indignation of the children of mercy who laid themselves down in the streets of Seattle in order to bring the World Trade Organization's autocracy to a halt. It is the shaken hearts of those who gathered at Ground Zero in Manhattan and begged for an end to the killing fields. It is surely every person's animal soul and the DNA code shared perfectly between every two humans alive, a genetic truth inside our cells that leaps back and forth across continents. That code insists on my kinship with both the elegant diner and the child with the wishbone legs, with the lorry nomad, and even perhaps with the bear. Roosters give milk here. Bears lay eggs. The lion could lie down with the lamb. A frozen groundswell just beyond our senses heaves and buckles, daring the world to dismantle these walls of enmity and use the stones to build ovens for baking bread. It would be the death of something and the life of something. Somewhere there must be a door through. The alternative is only to construct higher walls, and the higher they grow, the harder they will fall. It's hard to imagine a more frightening time than this. Oh God, Barbara. Fast forward to 2017. I know someone has said that already. People said it 1,000 years ago, and they've said it about nearly every minute that has gone by since. My parents' generation said it during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and their parents said it after Pearl Harbor. Mothers said it as they watched their sons ride off to fight in the Civil War, and they said it 100 years later when black-skinned children had to be escorted by armed officers through the doors of an all-white school. The day Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered, or Gandhi, or Jesus, or Monsignor Oscar Romero, or the day the Buddhist monks immolated themselves in Vietnam while the stunned world watched, all of these were the worst there could ever be. Scholars of history are fond of pulling up statements of dismay from time immemorial to prove to us that there is nothing new under the sun. The wolf was always at the door, and people have always been hell-bent on pulverizing one another exactly as they are now. The historians are right. It isn't new, this feeling of despair over a world gone mad with heartless and punitive desires. It isn't new that both sides rush to the fundamentalist presumption of themselves against the evil ones. It isn't even new that the world could fall apart and become permanently uninhabitable in a matter of minutes. That's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was about. What is new is that we now know so very much about the world, or at least the part of it that is most picturesquely exploding on any given day, that we're left with a desperate sense that all of it is exploding all the time. We see so much, understand so little, and are simultaneously told so much about what we think as a populace polled minute by minute that it begins to feel like an extraneous effort to listen at all to our hearts. I try with all my might to duck under this wire, not to believe in polls or allow the TV bluster anywhere near my face. At moments I have to stop taking in more news so I can consider what I've gathered so far and pay attention to my own community, since that is the only place where I can muster a posse to take on our own local disasters of the day. Sometimes I have to make a simple, straightforward effort to do just that, so I will feel less like a screen door banging in a hurricane. And that is what is really new since time immemorial, the sense that the problems are so vast in scope that we've lost any hope of altering the course of things. During previous eras of conspicuous doom, the Black Death, for example, people surely felt that the world was ending, but the end they probably pictured was smaller in scale, consisting of themselves, their neighbors, and God. They couldn't imagine a wreckage so appalling as the end of humankind on a planet made squalid by man's own hand. I doubt they had yet grasped the magnificence of our history or the infinitude of our foolishness. The feeling I dread most is not fear but despair, the dim, oppressive sense that the more things change, the more they stay the same, that each of us with a frozen heart, like an old stone savage armed, will continue to move in darkness, lifting boulders, patrolling the firmaments of divisive anger. I do not go gentle into that particular night. I burn and rave against the dying of all hope. I concede that there is mounting evil in this world, and that some hearts are so hardened already that they cannot possibly be appeased. Some walls grow higher each year, it's true. But others crumble. The people who said the sky would fall and God would weep if their sons and daughters had to sit in the same classroom as black-skinned children were wrong. The sky didn't, and whether or not God did is a matter of personal opinion. The earth has shifted beneath our feet time and again as the stones of our paradigms fell hard on the dust. Irrevocably, humanity inhaled a new era in 1772 when Lord Mansfield declared that slaves were free the moment they breathed the air of England. 60 years later, that promise was extended to the air of the whole British Empire, and 30-odd years after that, following a monstrous sacrifice of earnest belief on both sides, to the air of the United States. In the next century, at the end of which the women of Afghanistan fell from full citizenship to a nation of silent, peering eyes, there were many other countries, including mine, where women fasted and marched and fought for and gained the right to own property, then to vote, then to sit on a jury of their peers and be counted as fully human. Apartheid fell step by step in the United States and in South Africa. Mate choice and romantic love have come to be regarded, at least in some places, as private and sacrosanct privileges, limited only by the congenital rules of a complex human chemistry, even if the romance should cross lines of class or color or contradict the common presumptions of gender. Some of these changes I've witnessed in my lifetime. I began first grade in a segregated public school in a state whose anthem, which we children doggedly belted out each morning, contained the line, "'Tis summer, the darkies are gay." That unsettling declaration would be quietly revised many times for many reasons over the next 10 years. Time and again, the bear they had sworn to rip us... Time and again, the bear they had sworn would rip us limb from limb was begrudgingly allowed a place at the table, and behold, it used a fork and a spoon. The natural laws we have believed in and taught our children have sometimes been found to be not natural laws at all, but rather fearsome constructs of our own making, undermined by the evidence. And among those mistakes there is this: all of the promises of politicians, generals, madmen, and crusaders that war can create peace have yet to be borne out. With these startling honesties glinting up at us from history's broken mirror, it strikes me that this is worth shouting from the rooftops. We could be wrong this time again. The enemy may not be exactly what we think. It may be a force that resides in many quarters, including inside our skin, in our very words, the questions we frame, the things we love most, the things we can't live without. Our greatest dread may be our salvation. We are in no position yet to declare the moral of our story. But how, a friend in New York has asked me, do I live with the anger? On my street, where every night I smell the incinerated towers as I walk the dog, there is inescapable pain and rage. In this city, we bear the brunt of the struggle to figure out what it means to have our hearts cut away by hateful violence that the whole country somehow engendered. I hardly know how to answer that for myself, let alone for anyone else, and yet that struggle is, for so many of us, the currency of everyday survival. Most of us can't know how it feels to live in the shadow of those murdered towers. But nearly all of us care because we ourselves know what it means to have our hearts cut away by life. We've borne physical assaults, lost those we loved best, lost our own souls, our physical wholeness, the future we were counting on, had days we could not see how to get through. I understand that we'll have lost everything if a hateful enemy can crush us and reconstruct us in its angry image, but what other door may lead out of this dark room? I felt outrage I was sure would burn me alive. Some nights I've lain awake wondering how to keep on living while someone somewhere despises me and wishes so many of us dead because of our faith or nationality, assigning to us transgressions I can scarcely grasp. I wonder how to stay calm with so much beauty at stake, being scorched from my line of sight as trees fall and sacred places are ground to dust. I find it insufferable to bear silent witness to the flesh and bone devastations of war, and bitterly painful to be cast sometimes as a traitor to the homeland I love, simply because I raise questions. I find myself in a strange niche, reviled by some compatriots because I can't praise war as the best answer, and reviled everywhere else because my nation does. Each of us inhabits his or her own strange niche, I suppose. We've engendered animosity for many things that most of us never contrived to do, perhaps never even knew about. Many of us can't fully believe in all the imperatives that have been pronounced the will of our people. One problem with democracy as it plays in our country is that the majority rules so hard. We seem bent on dividing all things into a contest of win and lose, and declaring that the losers are losers. Nearly half of us are routinely asked to disappear while the slim majority works its will. But the playing field is the planet Earth, and I, for one, have no place else to go. The closest my heart has come to breaking lately was on the day my little girl arrived home from school and ran to me, her face tense with expectation, asking, "Are they still having that war in Afghanistan?" As if the world were such a place that in one afternoon, while kindergartners were working hard to master the letter L, it would decide to lay down its arms. I tried to keep the tears out of my eyes. I told her I was sorry. Yes, they were still having the war. She said, "If people are just going to keep doing that, I wish I'd never been born." I sat on the floor and held her tightly to keep my own spirit from draining through the soles of my feet. I don't know what other mothers say at such moments. I suppose some promise that only the bad men are getting hurt. I wish I could believe in that story myself. But my children have never been people I could lie to. My best revenge against all the dishonesty and hatred in the world, it seems to me, will be to raise right up through the middle of it these honest and loving children. I asked her, "Do you really mean that? You wish you'd never known Daddy or me or your sister? That you'd never gotten a chance to hug us or have us read books to you or tuck you in at night? Never gotten to take care of your chickens and gather their eggs? Never seen a rainbow?" Of course, she said soon enough that she was glad to be alive. And I'm sure that's true, as I watch her throw her heart and limbs into a mostly unburdened life. But I understood that day that we are all in the same boat. It's the same struggle for each of us, and the same path out. The utterly simple, infinitely wise, ultimately defiant act of loving one thing and then another, loving our way back to life. It used to be on so many days that I could close my eyes and sense myself to be perfectly happy. I've wondered lately if that feeling will ever come back. It's a worthy thing to wonder, but maybe being perfectly happy is not really the point. Maybe that is only some modern American dream of the point, while the truer measure of humanity is the distance we must travel in our lives, time and again, twixt two extremes of passion, joy and grief, as Shakespeare put it. However much I've lost, what remains to me is that I can still speak to name the things I love. And I can look for safety in giving myself away to the world's least losable things. My parents, before raising me, first had to spend every day of their lives from infancy into early adulthood coping with a Great Depression and then a war. As a consequence, they reared me under the constant counsel to trust spiritual values ahead of material ones and to look to the land for shelter. A house can burn down, they said, but a piece of land will always be there. These words came back to me profoundly on the bleakest day when we watched those two shattered towers billow smoke. I've internalized my parents' message in a way that is not precisely personal. After all, ownership of farms per se provided no safety for the Japanese Americans removed to concentration camps during World War II, many of whom lost everything. But I understand what they meant and have spent a lifetime learning to believe in things that can never burn down. I can invest my heart's desire and the work of my hands in things that will outlive me. Although it grieves me that houses are burning, I have fallen in love with a river that runs through a desert, a rainforest at the edge of night, the right of a species to persist in its own wild place, and the words I might assemble to tell their stories. I've fallen in love with freedom regardless, and the entitlement of a woman to get a move on, equipped with boots that fit and opinions that might matter. The treasures I carry closest to my heart are things I can't own, the curve of a 5-year-old's forehead in profile, and the vulnerable expectation in the hand that reaches for mine as we cross the street. The wake-up calls of birds in a forest, the intensity of the light 15 minutes before the end of day, the color wash of a sunset on mountains, the ripe sphere of that same sun hanging low in a dusty sky in a breathtaking photograph from Afghanistan. In my darkest times, I have to walk, sometimes alone, in some green place. Other people must share this ritual. For some, I suppose, it must be a path through a particular set of city streets, a comforting architecture. For me, it's the need to stare at moving water until my mind comes to rest on nothing at all. Then I can go home. I can clear the brush from a neglected part of the garden, working slowly until it comes to me that here is one small place I can make right for my family. I can plant something as an act of faith in time itself, a vow that we will, sure enough, have a fall and a winter this year to be followed again by spring. This is not an end in itself, but a beginning. I work until my mind can run a little further on its tether, tugging at this central pole of my sadness, forgetting it for a moment or two while pondering a school meeting next week, the watershed conservation project our neighborhood has undertaken, the farmers market it organized last year. The good that becomes possible when a small group of thoughtful citizens commit themselves to it. And indeed, as Margaret Mead said, that is the only thing that ever really does add up to change. Small change, small wonders. These are the currency of my endurance and ultimately of my life. It's a workable economy. Political urgencies come and go, but it's a fair enough vocation to strike one match after another against the dark isolation when spectacular arrogance rules the day and tries to force hope into hiding. It seems to me that there is still so much to say that I had better raise up a yell across the fence. I have stories of things I believe in, a persistent river, a forest on the edge of night, the religion inside a seed, the startle of wing beats when a spark of red life flies against all reason out of the darkness. One child, one bear. I'd like to speak of small wonders and the possibility of taking heart. Beethoven, Schubert, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, Haydn, Mozart. I cling to these things like a drowning man clings to a lifeboat.